Hello, this is Social Evolution. My name is Michael Borcelli, and I'm joined here with my co-hosts.
Max Borders here. Good to be with you all.
And today, we're going to talk about a pretty contemporary topic in society. It's a hot topic if you've been following the news and the headlines over the past few years, especially. Cryptocurrencies, tokens, distributed ledger technologies, and instead of noodling in on the technical details of all this, we're going to try to think about it in terms of like, why does this matter for the future of humanity, which is the central organizing principle here at Social Evolution. And we try to look at that past, present, and future of humanity through the lens of institution, culture, and technology. And this is very much focused on the technology part of it. And Max, why should we care? Why does this matter? Get us into this topic.
Well, from that big macro perspective, I think you nailed it. And that is technology in this case is dragging along institutions and culture, kicking and screaming. Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful thing because it's just rife with possibility. Now, we should, Michael Porcelli, let our listeners know that what this episode is not about, because there's plenty of shit like you could hear out there. For example, this is not about price predictions of individual tokens. This is not about highly technical details of the technology. We'll touch on some of that. After all, you are a computer scientist. Mm-hmm. But we really want to talk about the implications of this technology in the lives of human beings all around the world.
Right. So in a way, you might hear about people, trying to just get rich with the whatever, or, nerds geeking out on the technical details of these things. But sometimes you'll hear like little wisps of a conversation of like, well, what are the implications of Bitcoin or Ethereum or blockchains, distributed ledgers? Like, how does this ideas of governance and like somehow that there's some more fundamental possible ways of actually restructuring society in a way that's better than the systems and institutions we currently have. But it seems almost a little utopian when people start talking about this.
Let's think of it as a tech stack, right?
Uh-huh.
There is a moral political layer to the tech stack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So every time a coder makes a choice, in terms of developing a DApp, which is a distributed application or a decentralized application, they're making certain kind of choices about the ways humans can interact and should interact with each other.
Yeah.
And those choices represent a moral core, or to go with the stack metaphor, a moral, political, or cultural layer. And I think what has happened with the rise of these tokens and this sort of get rich quick psychology and the rest of it is that it tends to try to leave behind that moral cultural layer. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do, at least what I want to do with this, is not only talk about some of the implications, some of the history, past, present, and future, but also what it is and what it means to have technology be informed by moral cultural choices. Okay.
Yep.
And that's really that's not only an important feature of this conversation, it's going to be, I believe, necessary for it to continue to flourish, grow, and propagate itself around the world. This ain't about money. This is about morality. This ain't about coins. It's about culture.
Yes.
This ain't about token transfers. This is about transformation of society. So,
ooh, I like that.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah,
awesome. So, what I'm reminded of at this, I definitely want to, do the thing that we usually do and do the past, present, and future in a moment. But the thing that you just reminded me of as you were talking was a really cool book I read. It was Lawrence Lessig's first book in the 90s called Code. He's revised it and has a Code 2.0. And this idea that computer code, is not just like something that's just purely mathematical, like the solution to a problem or a structured form of logic, although it is those things, right? It is the embedding, and this is his argument, is like as we network together many computers. This was a very early internet time frame when he wrote this book. And he's basically saying, look, you know, these choices that we make in terms of how the user interface works, or what the business logic of the whatever the application is, the system that we're using, the piece of software that you're using, it carries within it essentially some moral or ethical valence. It carries some implementation of policy, and those policies are essentially grounded back in the human world in a very analogous way. You might sort of say like legislators or lawyers and judges, they do things like parse this like legalese stuff that's sort of written on paper, right? And all those volumes on the walls of the legal offices, and like, right? But they're like, they read it and they think through it, and it almost has this sort of weird specialized legalese syntax, very similar to how computer code has a very specialized syntax. And instead of a computer chip sort of executing the code, it's the brains of the lawyers going like, what does this mean, right? And essentially it's like a corpus of text, you might say, that is collectively evolving through time and giving us sort of like a means by which we arbitrate disputes and settle on, decisions, what justice actually means when it's applied on a case-by-case basis, how, social incentives are structured, legally and so forth. Lessig is basically saying, hey, computer science world, what you're doing when you're coding massive multi-user systems is similar to that activity. It's actually equivalent in a way. It's the implementation of policy. And that is, that actually stretches way back to kind of the psychology of computer science in an interesting way, which is like what we write in computer code is we choose to write this code versus that code because it's meaningful to us as humans. It's not just a pure abstraction. I mean, some theoretical parts of computer science deal with sort of pure mathematical problems, but in a way, like the day-to-day thing that most computer programmers, computer scientists are dealing with is how do we translate something that is essentially something that humans care about, right, in our social world into code that sort of carries out that function or some slice of a social function. And that's a pretty radical idea, but connecting these two things was something that Lessig did, I think, in a very powerful way. And it was, I sort of thought of as a milestone in the foundation of crypto law, really, which is kind of a background of cryptocurrency and all this stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the particular book in question, but the Lessig quote, code as law, gets interpreted at the very least by people in the crypto community as saying we are essentially rewriting in code using cryptography what is legal or illegal, what is permissible or impermissible.
Yep.
And the interesting thing about that idea is that if you go back to, Eric Hughes and the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto, what was his name? In any case, we'll put it in the show notes because the show notes are better than Max's memory. That's early onset dementia. But in any case, these early adopters of cryptography understood that they were creating a space of the permissible. That was the only argument to that was power. There was no argument that, at least in their minds, about the permissibility of peaceful human exchange, for example, or peaceful human communication or private communication. These were all values that they held. And there's almost like this sense of, it's not to say that these tools won't be misused for all manner of nefarious purposes.
They already are.
But so are hammers, right? You can kill your spouse with your hammer. You can house all kind, child pornography in your home. The tool is not the crime. Right. But they want to be able to monitor society as with some kind of giant panopticon in order to be able to control the behavior of actors in society. But some of the possible behaviors, permissible behaviors or impermissible behaviors ex ante
Mm-hmm.
became permissible.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have my transactions with another person monitored.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want my dealings to involve the imprimatur of a powerful third party who, from my standpoint, is arbitrarily shutting down peaceful,
Mm-hmm.
commercial,
Mm-hmm.
or communicative exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys really that is the kind of cultural bedrock, if you like, to some of the early folks inventing this stuff. The David
Yes.
Chalmers, the Nick Szabos of the world,
Yes.
the Wei Dai, some of these early Hal Finney, they were all part of this sort of cypherpunk movement
Mm-hmm.
that believed in some essential idea of not justice, law as justice, but rather justice as law.
Hmm.
And that we have really inverted that. And the question of how justice gets discovered through the interactions of people involved in free association, we get emergent law, we get common law, we get cultural phenomena about emergent culture, which we've talked about in other episodes. But with the inversion, we have this idea of elites in some sort of supposed deliberative process that ideally is going to be free of corruption and special interest capture and all this stuff. And through that sausage making, justice is going to be born, and justice comes out of our capitals.
Mm-hmm.
These guys said horseshit. Justice is a discovery process among human beings living together, hopefully peacefully, but when there are frictions, the law is an emergent property of reducing those frictions through that discovery process. And this revolution is more like that than it is Justinian law.
Yes. So let me see if I'm following everything you're saying here, because I think there's some things that I'm getting, and this is actually starting to kind of pull us into the historical past, which I love as a kind of touch point before we spring off into the future. What I'm hearing here is these early innovators, right? Like you mentioned, actually some digicash or ecash, or this kind of idea that came out of the 80s. These predecessors from maybe like 30 BitGold. These things way preceded Bitcoin, which was 2009 Satoshi Nakamoto white paper that kind of really actually sort of solved what these folks were trying to solve for. But like their ethos, right? Their values, their justification for what they were doing was something akin to like, look, the way that there are these central controls, central banks, and then their clients, the commercial banks, and other kinds of ways that markets are regulated by the state are actually constraining exchange that otherwise, free citizens might want to do with each other. And I mean, this is a little bit of a kind of classic tension between something like, I suppose, like statutory Napoleonic law from the European continent versus kind of English common law, which is a little bit more emergent, or the difference between something like a libertarian political order, which is sort of like, let a thousand flowers bloom, like the keep the state as a minimalistic sort of entity so that we just allow for freedom and for there to be, like you said, discovery along the way.
Well, and to mute the aspirations of empires, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the common things about empires is think about the Romans, not the Roman Republic, but the Roman Empire.
Right.
And this is a blurring together. There was territorial expansion of the Republic for sure. And yet, that's marked by the Republican form more than it is about territorial expansion. And yet, we are seeing we see very similar patterns with Britannia, with Rome, and with the United States, which is the expansion of empire around the world. Our military empire extends to 800 bases around the world. That's insane. And that is a powerful, powerful juggernaut of a military hierarchy that needs to be fed daily with billions of dollars. Okay. So how do you do that if you don't have enough money to do it? Well, you have to engage in debt spending. And if you engage in debt spending, you have to control the currency of a society. So one of the biggest intermediaries is the imperial state. And I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but just to say, look at the patterns of history. The guys who were working on this strong cryptography were fully understood the lessons of history. And that is the first thing you want to do is control the currency, have it be by fiat, which is why we have the word fiat currency. It means I deem it so.
Yeah, decree.
Right?
Yeah.
By decree. And through that decree, for example, in Rome, you got a ducat or whatever the hell they called it, probably different things over the years, but you would have a piece of silver of a certain size and weight.
Yeah.
And over years and years, every time they would put that imprimatur, that stamp of the ducat with the face of the emperor on it, every couple of years or so, that silver would be less and less a proportion of the total coin. And that was literally adulterating the silver or debasing the currency. Today, we do that through sophisticated mathematical processes like quantitative easing or adding zeros to the number. So we have so many dollars chasing too few goods, and that ends up being inflationary. But that power to inflate, that intimate and unholy connection between central banks and governments has always been there. And that though, you have this halo effect that sometimes central bankers want to put on in terms of our goal is employment, our goal is stability of the currency. It's like whatever property you like is not available in a monolithic system of currencies. They only have one set of properties. And in the crypto revolution, we said, not only do we want to disintermediate the financial system, for example, banks and central banks, we want to introduce certain properties that would make the digital money, deflationary. That can cause a certain degree of volatility, but that is also a byproduct that some people are willing to accept, particularly in the age of let's give people free money for COVID. And so now we're in an era where there is a war in the evolutionary fitness landscape, where markets and the power of persuasion to come into certain kinds of systems protected by cryptography on the one hand, central banks, entrenched incumbent institutions on the other, and this war is going to heat up.
Yeah.
And I think the best and brightest minds in the world need to be prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah. Cool. It's fascinating. Like, we're kind of on the cusp, and, this emerging crypto economics is really, and what we're doing as well in talking about it, maybe more in a theoretical sense, is trying to think about what is exactly that social function that, we're both sort of criticizing, but I want to kind of do maybe a good parts version, which is like, hey, it's a social emergent, right? This kind of goes way back, the historical antecedents stretch. I mean, I can't exactly know when, I don't think any of us really can, but, circa 12,000 years ago, humans settled from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. They stopped being essentially nomadic hunter-gatherer clans, and they started to kind of gather, especially during certain kind of times of the year, like post-harvest, to like these temple locations. I think they recently discovered one. It's the oldest one they've ever found. But we get together, and like a certain priestly class emerges at that time. And you might say this is sort of the earliest middlemen, or maybe you could say it's sort of the evolution of the chieftain or the
I mean, both of it's funny that you're talking about this, because it just is only now occurring to me that with the settled agriculture, you get this co-emergence of the money changers.
Yes.
Right?
The money changers, yes.
Which, the stereotype is about the Jews, because that's the biblical, stuff we like to talk about.
Yep.
And having now having married into Jewish family and having a Jewish daughter,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I like to be sensitive about these stereotypes, but also they exist for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there a coevolution of Jewish diaspora and
Mm-hmm.
being accountants and moneylenders.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting one. In parallel with that,
yeah,
you get with settled agriculture, the tax man. You get this.
Yeah.
It is a, I mean, you can deny it all you like, but James C. Scott really did the good work in this book called Against the Grain. And he basically argues that the state originated and more or less still is a protection racket. It's like, I'm going to come and take a little bit of your grain. And in exchange, I'm going to protect you from other people who are going to come and offer you the same deal, only worse, or a similar deal, only worse.
Yeah.
And when seen in that light, these proto-imperial powers, this tribal chieftain or this asshole that comes along and gives you this deal, it's like, well, that's a pretty good deal because now our agriculture is settled. We can't go anywhere. I'm not strong enough to fight it. At least this guy's going to be able to fight off all the other brigands that come along.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we get a hierarchy where the warrior class is essentially on top. But in parallel with that, we get these middlemen who are able to supply some sort of proto-market function.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Well, it's kind of fun. It's almost like the nerdiest of the nerds and the jockiest of the jocks sort of like team up and they go, we'll do like this central like planning or whatever, proto central planning. But you know, I sort of like let's argue for it from just a benign or maybe a less sinister point of view. It's like it's a little bit of a transaction cost thing as well. Like why should I, as a shepherd, have to like independently negotiate all kinds of deals all over the place? I mean, maybe with my neighbors I do, but like you can show
I can't afford it.
Right. Like, so let's essentially offload some of this function, and some of the function is the protection, and some of the function is math, right? Like, or something, right? Like, you know, where the weights and the measures, and you know, you'll roll up with your little wagon with your oxen full of your shit, and then they'll roll up with their wagon, and we all come together. And then,
and the rabbi can write,
right,
and do numbers.
No, right, yeah, no. This is the invention of writing, like, or you know, like at least one of the earliest uses of writing was this. We're gonna just track these accounts, and like, it's a little voodoo. I mean, if you're like an illiterate farmer, which basically all the farmers were, and you show up to this place, and this guy's dressed up in these robes, and he's like, look, and he's just putting things on a thing and like putting little marks on a clay tablet or whatever.
It's very esoteric.
Right. You're just like, what the fuck's going on here? But like somehow there's some, if it's sort of contained in some kind of ritualistic or feast atmosphere or like a cultural celebration. I mean, religion kind of comes into play here as well, which basically says like, look, this is validated for all of us, or we're going to at least say that it's validated, and we're all going to kind of abide, we're going to mutually agree. All right, we're going to abide by these rules. And essentially the priestly class is doing something like market making at the beginning. Like it's almost like the proto-state or whatever you want to call this and the making of economic markets go together. It's partly what they're there for in a way, like and they're kind of assuming or taking on this social function, which truth is, I think there's like a historical distaste for it. Like I think of sort of like medieval Europeans' distaste for Jews doing money exchange, or libertarians' distaste for the fucking state doing this kind of, or central banks doing this kind of thing, or like there's sort of this weird thing like it's like it's concrete. If I'm a blacksmith, you know what I do, right? If I'm a farmer, you know what I'm doing, right? Like. You see it because there's a physical good
product of it.
Right.
Look at this great piece of armor.
Right.
This gauntlet that I've fashioned from metal.
Yeah.
Here you go.
I did that.
Yeah, I did that. Right. And then the farmer, he gives you a bag o' corn.
Right.
Right. There's something there that you get out of the exchange. It's obvious. It's certainly not invisible and esoteric.
Right. Yeah.
With accounting, whatever kind of accounting you like, whether it's early temple accounting or it's, double entry accounting from Florence or whatever, you're getting, it's sort of like there's some kind of intermediary here. I got to work through this person. They're taking some off the top. If I'm borrowing money from it, what the hell am I getting out of that? Except having to give back more money later. It's really hard. You get this prohibition on usury throughout the Judeo-Christian world, and yet you get this simultaneous like toleration of the Jews around, for example, Italy in the Middle Ages, because Jews weren't Christians, and in Christianity there's a prohibition on usury, which is lending money. But among the Jews, there wasn't. So it's like, well, we can kind of skirt this by tolerating the Jews. We'll keep them around and we'll still suppress them, oppress them, and all that jazz. But this ordering function in society actually turns out to be kind of necessary, and we're just going to let it go so that we don't have to dirty our hands and go to hell with usury.
Yes, exactly.
But then you got these, so suddenly all of a sudden you got this powerful intermediary that uses force to pop heads and keep them in line. That's the Hobbesian rationale, right?
Sure. Yeah.
This overwhelming Leviathan that keeps order.
Yep.
And that's sort of the Hobbesian rationale for everything under the sun requiring the state.
Otherwise, we would just, run around like wild animals, ripping each other's heads off or something.
Yeah, because, after all, life is nasty, brutish, and short, right?
Exactly.
Then you got this other, and back then it sure as hell was. It's not,
in a lot of ways.
That's a pretty strong argument, right?
Yep.
Likewise, you have this ordering function that's kind of mysterious, but I know I need to borrow money for certain things, and I don't like it. There's something that leaves a bad taste in my mouth about it, but it's the only option I've got. So this sort of sticks around and thrives, but at least I'm not going to hell, right?
Right.
And so now you've got this idea of the middleman.
Yep.
And you've got these intermediaries who serve functions in society, but there's such an information asymmetry between the providers of those services and the recipients of those services that you get tabooization around their function.
Exactly.
And so your modern advocates of cryptocurrency or anarchy or libertarianism or sort of even leftish hostility to usury, to money lending is all a kind of feature of first not understanding the function of the simple fact of opportunity costs. If I can't deploy this capital for something that benefits me, my family, or society, then there ought to be some sort of price or cost associated with that.
Yeah,
we call that interest, but that's really hard for people. That rationale, just that little species of knowledge right there, is not enough when you explain it to people to dissolve the taboo. They think it's, rich people just get richer because they deploy capital through loans or VC, and they don't understand an investment, and they don't understand loans. Yeah. And if they do, some of them still say it's evil. So that's an interesting phenomenon. So whether or not you think it's evil, I happen not to. I think financial institutions provide a very interesting set of services. But I also think if those can be made redundant through technological means and peer-to-peer exchange, abso-fucking-lutely. I don't care about keeping bankers in jobs. What do you think?
I think it's totally. I mean, now we're feeling into the motivation, and I think you said it, but maybe I'll just emphasize it here for the listeners. Like, this is not just about something that might sort of seem like more like a right-wing libertarianism critique of like the state. You could also see it on the left, like you said.
Yes.
Critique of
absolutely
investment bankers and it's like, what are those people doing over there? They're just
Occupy
moving money.
Wall Street.
Yeah, they're just moving money around and like skimming off the top by just trading money for other kinds of money, and that's also evil, right? Like
they're creating a zero-sum game, and they're sucking the resources out of the poor and the middle class.
Pyramid scheme, right? Yeah.
So this is definitely a bipartisan hatred for financial institutions.
Yes.
And their collusion with the state, which is on full display after 2008.
Yes, totally, which is where we got Occupy Wall Street from. Exactly. So, so here's the thing. Like, if we think about this coordination function, now I'm going to get a little maybe computer science or information theory here, like, or maybe even like monetary economics, which is, it's interesting. Like whatever that was that the temple culture was doing all the way up through what financial markets do today is something like a kind of coordination, a social coordination function that's mediated through the exchange of information, right? I mean, really fundamentally, you can talk about this sort of within a corporation like we did on our Cutting Edge of Organizations episode. And now we're talking about more broadly in the marketplace at large, right? But what are we doing here? We're trying to like find some way of essentially communicating openly about how to coordinate the allocation of energy, time, right? Like it's all raw materials, right? And we have this ideal of the pricing mechanism. We invented this thing called money, right? And we have a thing called prices. And then we have this rationale that sort of surrounds it that says, look, we have this thingy that is like, what are the three things that money is supposed to do? It's supposed to be a medium of exchange and a unit of account and a store of value.
And a unit of account.
And yeah. These things, this is what it's supposed to do for society. And like, it's a little bit like a magical thing, right? But it's so magical, just to really drive the point home here. Like, empires rise and empires fall, man. Like, Rome came and Rome went, but like, there was money before Rome, there was money during Rome, and there's still money after Rome. That as a social technology transcends the rise and fall of civilizations. And we still have it. And I think what's interesting right now in the crypto economics world is we're talking about like, well, can we, I mean, some people are trying to straightforwardly say, we're just going to replace what money, what fiat currency money, this kind of decree currency by the state does, with this other thing where we say our giant decentralized network of computers is like the intermediary or something like this. And it does what money does, medium exchange, unit account, store of value. But then there's people who kind of go like, you know, Bitcoin makes a shitty medium of exchange because its price is fluctuating so much, like its value is fluctuating so much. So like, but maybe we can actually tease apart, right? Because fundamentally, you know, there are people who sort of wax mystical about money. And I think gold buggery people or Bitcoin maximalist people tend to be this way sometimes. We're sort of like, it's the
central
thing.
bankers.
Yeah, central bankers. It's the thing that is the reference point that is like around which all this other shit rotates. And it's like, right, it has some almost like a sacred whatever, something to it. And, you know, I think as soon as we got off the gold standard and some of these economic ideas of the subjective theory of value, and, you know, the value of any currency is just floating against any other currency. There actually is no ground value now in markets. It's just the value of everything is just floating against the value of all the other things, which is a little bit weird, but like it's magical. But I think it's actually more realistic, right? It really is an aggregate output of a social calculation, which is the aggregate output of the coordination of all of our economic activities. So in a way, cryptocurrency is not just replace money, but if we get really clever with it, can we actually create maybe novel ways of coordinating information across populations? Like, I think that's also interesting.
Well, so there's so much good stuff in what you just said. I love it. Let me see if I can pick out a few pieces.
Cool.
The first one is, it's like questioning the idea of a monolithic system of money.
Right.
Okay. Second, questioning the idea that monolithic system of money needs to be determined by a central authority, and that its properties are determined by a central authority. When you question the idea of a monolithic system of money, a money monopoly, you start to really get to the idea. And look, even the Bitcoin maximalists or the so-and-so maximalists fall prey to this. It's like, don't tell me what properties I want in my money. Okay. Because the idea is maybe I need one property at one point. I'll use my Bitcoin, for example, to store value safely because I know they put more emphasis on security, for example, small blocks so it won't be taken over. There are all of these features, technical features we can get into if you like, but suffice it to say, at the end of the day, what the technical people who are working on Bitcoin BTC really emphasize is the security.
Right.
Okay. And that's why you have proof of work. That's why you have, solve cryptographic problems in order to, get through a block, and make sure that all of these cryptographic puzzles are being solved with some degree of simultaneity, so that that all of the machines around the world are working in synchrony, so that no person can do double spending and rip the system off. I mean, there's all kinds of really weird technical shit behind Bitcoin.
Yep.
And sometimes we want to emphasize other properties. So sometimes I want scalability. I want massive throughput. If I can achieve both security and throughput, which is to say many, many different transactions per second, like other cryptocurrencies are promising, then maybe Bitcoin is not the be-all, end-all of everything. Maybe the second layer solutions are a kludge, second layer solutions being, on top of the early Bitcoin standard. There are all these second layer things that are trying to make it faster, but run afoul of first layer limitations, right? There are concerns about that for the longevity of Bitcoin. But if Bitcoin is only a store of value, like a digital gold, then Bitcoin can stick around and still serve that function to be a personal Fort Knox for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then other cryptocurrencies can come along and say, hey, but our throughput is fast. Like, the transaction is instantaneous, and there's still a high degree of certainty about its security. So let me have this other property. When you start to consider the dizzying array of properties in this evolutionary ecosystem, it disabuses us of this, not only this idea of a monopoly that has to have one set of properties at all, and opens the door to the idea that maybe we actually need different properties for different contexts, and different tokens supply those different properties. And now I'm not dealing in a world of dollars. I'm trading my Cardano, my Ethereum, my Apple stock that's been tokenized, my whatever, just to buy a fucking cup of coffee. How cool is that?
Yeah. I think it's pretty cool. I mean, it runs the issue of being sort of too complex for the everyday person to deal with. And I think this is the simplifying aspect of a single currency, a fiat in a geographical area backed by a state, or maybe even there's something simplifying for global markets to have something like the US dollar as the global reserve currency and the British pound prior to that. But I do want to say that, like, this idea of, like, oh, look at all this novel shit you can do with crypto. There actually are antecedents for this in the pre-crypto world. So one of my favorite examples historically was it was like the miracle of Vorgel in Austria in the 1930s. Did you hear about this? This is like right in the global depression, right? Like, it was the Great Depression. And they basically created a local currency, which was a demurrage currency. And demurrage, for our listeners, is basically inverse interest. So if you hold on to the money, it loses value. So you want to spend it faster. So, they actually did it with these little stickers that would go on this bill, like at a certain date.
So it increases the velocity of the currency.
That's correct. So it's a feature. And essentially the miracle of Virgil is this town essentially protected itself from the global depression by inventing its own local currency that everyone was incentivized, due to the design of the currency with this demurrage or negative interest on it, to spend. So the money kept circulating so people could keep exchanging goods and services and stay working rather than unemployed, which is fascinating. And I'm not trying to say the thing you're trying to point to is we don't want to then sacralize this one version. Everything should be demurrage currency, right? But it is a feature, right? It's it's doing something about money, like a medium of exchange, really well, but it's not doing store of value very well at all, right? You don't want to hold on to it at all. You want to keep sending it around as fast as you can. And these, to
it's
broaden
very Keynesian.
Sure. Well, this is what you get here is very interesting, like, because the question of decoupling these features of money, like, I think even Keynes wanted to create some kind of like giant mutual. So if there's another pathway here, which we can talk about the nerds and the computer scientists and the people who want to create digital currency, but there's another one which is communities.
Community currencies, that sort of
community
thing.
currencies, LETS systems, like local exchange trading systems, or time banks, or mutual credit.
Banking, mutual credit systems.
Yeah, these things existed for a very long time. We're sort of like, oh, we all know, like, the value is sort of almost being generated by, hey, we're, I did this for you and you did that for me, and so we kind of like actually like enter that into the system, and we have like a shared ledger. And prior to the emergence of crypto, there was some of these hardworking co-op, coder people were like trying to build these LETS systems for like communities to like do time banking exchange with each other.
Dude, so you're in San Diego.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm in Austin. And I think north of San Diego is like, I forgot the name of it. It's a little hippie town near you.
Rainbow?
I don't know. Anyway,
okay.
sounds plausible. Yeah. And we have hippie towns around here. We have what's called the consciousness community here. And you have, I'm sure, your species of it in California and in Boulder. Spades, right?
Yep.
So one of the things, Charles Eisenstein came out with this book called Sacred Economics, and it's got some interesting ideas in it. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to criticize this, because there's a wider point here that is, but it sort of fetishizes the pay it forward, sort of gift economy, time banking, mutual credit, this kind of stuff, which is great for certain contexts. Some of these kind of systems that people try to devise really run afoul of like how price is determined intersubjectively. So run afoul of the price system, run afoul of intersubjective agreement about price, and how that, a willingness for multiple market actors to behave in a certain way relative to the others in patterns of exchange. You don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater in trying to architect some idealized, whatever you want to call it, conscious monetary system.
Right.
But I do want to give a shout out to those guys in the sense, like, yes, do it locally, do it, charitably, experiment with these things. And I could be completely wrong in my Mengerian biases about the nature of money and about the nature of society. And if you're right, or if at least you're right within your tiny enclave, let 1,000 blooms.
Yes.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let 1,000 cryptocurrencies be born.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, this is where I get kind of excited, because, you and I are really into this idea of like, let's see what happens when we run all these experiments in parallel. And that's how we kind of get, I mean, that's the nature of evolution, right? The nature of evolution is lots of competing experiments and lots of variation, and they just collide with each other, and like they're proven out by essentially some real ground level of like, well, how much energy efficiency essentially, can it do, like, to create organization out of its usage of energy. And like, that's the basis of all life. Okay, cool. So let's do that. I think you're right. Like, I think it's a good thing that Keynes didn't get his way when he proposed one of these gigantic mutual credit systems, like that could be like a whole union for like a whole nation. That never happened.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that Keynes proposed that never got built. Although, interestingly, what are they called? There's an Israel-based Keynesian Bancor token that does some interesting stuff based on Keynes and this other French economist. In any case, I encourage listeners to look into it. We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we did get a lot out of Keynes for the world order that we're living in today. So it's not only that we have this massive central bank in the United States, where you and I are talking from, called the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yep.
It is that the Federal Reserve Bank is, in a sense, the de facto central bank for the world.
Right.
Despite the protestations of the World Bank and the IMF and all this stuff, right? Because the world reserve currency is the US dollar. That came straight out of Bretton Woods, and Keynes was, of course, the foremost economist at Bretton Woods. They didn't invite Hayek Hormesis to Bretton Woods, although that, that
Could have
would have
been
been
interesting.
that would have been interesting. Instead, they had Keynes, and they created the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and then in 19, I want to say 48, 49 was the Bretton Woods agreement. Anyway, it was right after the war, and they were trying to establish a kind of capitalish, not capitalist, but capitalish world order that would stand in juxtaposition to communism on the one hand, because Keynes was not a communist. He had some socialist sympathies, and of course he is the poster child for economic interventionism on the part of central powers.
Yes.
And he, of course, likes the idea of architecting systems of financial systems as if they were some kind of machine that can be designed. What we got out of Bretton Woods persists to this day, and we have a world based on, we are lucky as hell. Peter Zehan calls it an exorbitant privilege to have the dollar as the world reserve currency, because it allows our government to spend into oblivion and add zeros to things, give away free money. But relative to other countries who are doing the same, it manages to be the only game in town. The dollar, still the strongest among all the currencies.
Yep.
Except for 2009. Something happened.
Yep. There's a branch here where there's this kind of like global issue around the design of giant machines and like the implications of currency and whether or not they do need to be tied to some kind of militaristic imperial power. But then I think there's another part where we kind of branched to here about the lets and the local stuff. I want to go back to the local thing real quick and then maybe back to the global thing. Is that cool?
Right on.
So what I think is interesting in terms of these antecedent alternative currencies, and this is where I want to just say, like, I have an intuition that we're sort of returning maybe to a previous world where there was more local, like banks administering their own banknotes or something like this, but not exactly the way it used to be. But we like have frequent flyer miles, right? Or you're earning points with your credit card, or whatever you want to call it, like loyalty dollars, or you buy a gift card, right? You turn an Amazon gift card is weird. You're turning dollars into dollars that can only be spent on Amazon or something like this. But like
NFTs, old school NFTs.
Yeah. I mean, we're creating essentially a construct, and this is where I think this is sort of like fundamental thinking about the nature of the currency and its different functions socially. And instead of thinking about this thing like a dollar, a reserve currency that does these three things: medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value, we can break it apart. And we already have that. It's not like, oh my God, this is just brand new to the crypto world. This has existed for a really long time, right? Like you can think of coupons, or you could even think of these more exotic financial instruments, like these weird derivatives that are traded by financial institutions. And if you spend enough time like looking at these fucking weird things, collateralized debt obligations, and all that shit that got the financial markets into trouble in 2008, what the hell? Mutual funds and like, I mean, all these different weird things. Like, what are they? They're just some giant kind of concatenation of social contracts. That's what they are, right?
Yeah.
That says like the value of a thing that is tied to the value of another thing and what it will be worth in the future, or like. Or like a T-bill, which is sort of like an inverse debt where we're loaning money to the state. I mean, all of these different things are already these interesting little nexus of social agreement that are communicating information at a large scale amongst many actors within a society.
There's only one problem with that, let's call it legacy ecosystem.
Okay.
Is that the intercession of the central bank. Okay, it's absolutely true that this functions as a certain kind of financial ecosystem with many different creatures in it, if you like.
Yep.
Okay,
the current system, the legacy system
current
already has
system.
this.
But there is when your system is denominated in dollars, there is nothing that the central bank doesn't touch through its activity. Okay? So going back to this idea of centralization and the politicization of money, which happens all the time because government wants to do what governments do. State's going to state. State's going to spend. State's going to debt spend. It has every incentive. The incentives are all built around debt spending.
Yeah.
So if anything you're talking about, whether it's miles or whatever, are denominated in dollars. Now, you might have airline miles that are immune to that. I don't know. I'd have to, ask the economist or someone smarter than me like you.
They're still translated through dollars, right? Your airline frequent.
I think so. Yeah. If they never cross that, I don't know. But in any case, those are also subject to change by the corporations that control them. You can put time limits on them. They have their own ability to debase those currencies, right? Through the fine print of your little agreements.
Yep.
So that central banking function is always tethered to power, coercive power. And I know that sounds like some kind of sort of crypto anarchist craziness, but it's not. It is just acknowledging the raw coercive power at the center of which the center of that empire is also going to be two primary things: a central bank and a standing army that can kick every other standing army's ass. It is no accident that the Federal Reserve in the United States is the most powerful empire on earth. And that is because those two things. And when the state does what it needs to do through debt spending, the Federal Reserve has no choice but to reach into its bag of tricks and figure out ways to oblige that power. It cannot go against that power. So it has to debase the currency. It has to inflate. So that is why we're seeing today, in 2021, the price of housing go through the roof, the price of building materials, the price of food, the price of probably cryptocurrencies, even though those are an inflation hedge more than any other instrument. Asset prices, we have a really frothy market right now for stocks and things. They're all denominated in dollars. So there's all these new dollars in the ecosystem now, trying to find a place to go to be safe. You can't find anywhere to go besides gold in the past, right? Gold was, traditionally speaking, the only thing that would provide an inflation hedge.
Or real estate.
Well, to some degree, but we have housing bubbles. 2008, 2009, it wasn't a very good idea to use housing as an inflation hedge from 2000 to 2008.
Right.
Those
were instrumentalized. Those were intermediated by these exotic debt instruments.
Right. There's a whole complicated stew of shit that central banking and the Treasury Department and all these people that architected in you basically forcing the major financial institutions to take TARP money. I mean, there's this whole just Ely story of how that we narrowly escaped total and utter collapse, and we did get a great recession.
Yeah, Michael Lewis what is his book? That was a fun kind of romp through that whole thing.
Yeah, and he's a fun writer, and he focuses less on the problem of power and more on the problem of finance.
Sure, but
it gives you half of the story, and it's a good one, well told story. So anyway, the point being, when you have these two, this decision makers about what the properties of the financial system are, and a single decision maker that has a standing army, and they are de facto colluders, it is really, really hard to do anything but accept the economic conditions that result from the capricious behavior of state actors.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
I think I think maybe we have the fixings for a little bit of a debate now. Maybe I think this could be kind of fun. This is good. I love that you're laying it out in this way. And there's sort of two fronts here. One is the kind of like, whatever you want to call it, this like I don't know. Is there some kind of thing called mini economics we can use as a new label? Because it's not quite micro and it's not quite macro. It's like whatever these little collectives of, like one of these time banks or mutual credit systems or Amazon gift cards or airline miles, whatever this kind of tier of like
consent based economic systems.
Yeah. But it's like it's like sort of at a meso level, right, between the macro and the micro. And what I think is true, and you can maybe try to poke holes in this, is there's always going to be some kind of soft coercion, right? If I stay in the system, right, and I'm just like swapping coupons with you, but like we can only spend dollar coupons at Amazon. It's just, use that as a simple example. We can trade coupons or something like that. There may be a price, a sort of a penalty to get out of that system. Like as long as we're trading within it, I'll give you miles, you give me miles, whatever. It's sort of great, and we get almost like a what do you call that? Like a benefit. There's like maybe a carrot sort of benefit for like keeping our trades within the system. There may be even like something like demurrage, which actually encourages us to circulate it. There doesn't have to be, but like that is a trading zone with all the other participants in it. But then if I'm like, I want out, right? Then I have to find somebody who's sort of at the perimeter. I got to go to an exchange somewhere and like be like, hey, buy me out of my whatever it is, right? If I was like a co-owner of a co-op, I might have to essentially go to the online forum, which is the private, forum for all the people who own the co-op, and say, hey, I want to leave the co-op. Who wants to buy me out, right? And then you have to find buyers within the system who are willing to essentially put more of their dollars in and give them to you, right? And then they get back more shares of the co-op, right? They're essentially like, they're sort of expressing their belief in, no, man, I'm more into this co-op, while you're kind of like, no, I'm more out, right? But whatever this is, this is not the stick like a military, but there is some kind of coercion that's keeping people in the bubble of that zone of trade. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, another way of looking at it is it's a kind of gravity. Okay.
Yeah. Like a network effect, a gravitational pull. Yeah.
That's right. That's exactly where I was headed with that. So you have the dollar, which, people in the cryptocurrency space call the ultimate shit coin, right? Because of its shitty shitbag properties. Of course, the people who apologize for the dollar try to, mistake MasterCard for the dollar. Say, look how fast the transaction speeds are. Not without MasterCard. So, okay, go fuck yourself. Right. But anyway, my biases are showing a little bit. But I agree with them that the dollar is the ultimate shitcoin, and yet the dollar still has powerful gravitational effects because it's network effects. And what do we mean by network effects? We can use that terminology. We'll put it in the show notes. But it's really important because there's myriad ways in which if other people are doing things, there is a value in the network. Okay,
that's right.
All right. There's a thing called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law applies sometimes. In other cases, it doesn't. But if Metcalfe's law is so profound, the value of the network is the square of the number of nodes, for example, which shows a kind of scaling law effect to the value of the network. It's just, even if you want to use it as a metaphor, it gives you the idea that there's more gravity around more people using something.
The more people use it, the more people want to use it. Yeah.
The more people use it, the more people want to use it, the more they're going to have already borne the costs of taking the money, of the taxation system associated with it. So if you want to, it's like, it's not that easy to take cryptocurrency yet. And it's also, a lot of people don't even know how to. It's still a rather esoteric kind of phenomenon. If you talk to the average person on the streets, it's like, well, I got dollars, they're fine. Yes, we got inflation, but whatever. They're not living in Argentina and they're not living in fucking Venezuela. So they don't have the incentive yet to care, to take the businesses don't have the incentive. How am I going to do this with my accounting? Like taking
Mm-hmm.
cryptocurrency and dollars and all this stuff, that sounds complicated. You know, so part of the creating network effects around the user ecosystem of cryptocurrency tokens is going to involve getting people to accept it as readily as they do dollars. And that's really, in some sense, if, at least for cryptocurrencies, the last mile that needs to be established for game over, at least in the United States, right? Because in countries like Venezuela, there are so many users as a proportion of the population just because they're living in hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is basically, you know, taking a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a cup of coffee. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. So it's funny
that's the carrot incentive. The gravitational pull of the network effect is the thing that just has people naturally want to do it. The more people, it's like almost like FOMO. The more people are doing it, the more I want to be a part of that. But there's also these other penalty incentives, like soft sticks, like there's a penalty to get out, or hard sticks, like states will come like throw you in jail if you don't pay your taxes. But like, right, there's some other kind of whatever you're going to call it, perimeter social function that sort of like makes people keep trading within it. I mean, there's a sort of a question: do we need those kinds of things in these sorts of systems to do that, or do we just get rid of these stick incentives altogether?
I mean, I think I would argue you want to get rid of all stick incentives so that the full benefits of new network effects and new properties and the emergence of new properties. Look, let's think about computing. You know, earlier you were talking about, well, it's just not simple, you know. And I know, you know, you're playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, and I appreciate that. But one of the things you said earlier is like, people just don't understand, you know, it gets too complex. It gets too, you know, managing your private keys and all that shit gets to be complicated. They're going to have to do better than that. I'll tell you that right now. There's going to have to be mechanisms for mom and pop to be able to use cryptocurrency safely without all this private key management and all this other, you know, weirdness. Somebody's going to have to crack that too. That's another user interface thing that needs to happen to have full adoption, simplicity and security combined. But in any case, going back to this idea of it being complicated to use, that is true. And the idea that there are different properties that you might want to learn about and might be able to use is also a kind of a weird thing to imagine when it comes to money, because we have this framing that has been with us for our entire lives. There is only one currency, and it is the
dollar.
The dollar, or if you're in Germany, you know, it was the mark, and now it's the euro. But you know, the dollar or the euro, whatever sort of monolithic system you're living in with its associated monolithic properties, would be like going back in time and buying a new Mac and using what was that like proto Excel thing you were telling me about, or maybe it was someone else, but I remember VisiCalc. Yeah. So you would go buy a Mac to get VisiCalc, and that's what people thought you would buy a personal computer for, was to get that one application.
Yeah.
And likewise, so now we're living in an age of, you know, fast forward 40 years, and we're living in an age of, you know, smartphone technology. We don't have 2 apps. We have countless apps. And that's freaking complicated. We should be scared of that. Maybe. I bet people are adapting nicely, and they will with time.
Yeah.
So I believe that you can achieve certain level of stasis, a certain level of adoption, and in a complex environment, if you are prepared for a little bit of change at a rate that people can handle, and they can see the benefits of immediately. Right? That allows us a state of affairs that means the adoption of cryptocurrencies can be normalized. It has to a very great degree already in the last 5 years, for example. And I'm a goober. You know this about me, Michael Porcelli, that as Max Borders is pretty good in theory, when it comes to technology, you have to spend 5 minutes before we get on every time holding my hand through the goddamn mic hookups and all of the different things I need to mute and this and that in order to make it work.
Yeah.
People like me who are having a great time in the abstraction land need help with user interface on some of this stuff. But I don't want to extend this paragraph out too long. To put a period at the end of it, I would say this is the nature of the evolving ecosystem. And there are going to be powerful forces that emerge in the ecosystem that replace the need for the stickification. Programmable incentives make redundant the need for sticks.
So, right. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we need to kind of parse out what we mean by stick exactly. But yes, I think I get what you're saying. If we think of the hard stick as the thing that you're talking about. But here, I think we kind of maybe enter in some more territory that's worth debating. So if there's some amount of barrier to entry, you could say, the SEC's rules about being an institutional investor provide a barrier to entry to essentially like, openly trade stocks, at a certain tier of whatever, or VCs qualify, their investors at a certain level or higher, and they don't take anybody who's lower than that. And there's reasons why. And the idea here is like you're pre-qualified to like essentially be smart enough, supposedly, to not get taken advantage of by hucksters or, pyramid scheme people like Bernie Madoff, although he's a great exception because he fucking really deceived a whole lot of people. But the idea here is some amount of like barrier to entry or even penalty to leaving, which can be built in. Like if we're talking about the wonderful world of like, let's transfer one of these kind of like progressive style, mesoeconomic sort of co-op mutual thingies, like, oh, cool, there's several thousand of us. It's not billions of us or even millions of us. But like, there's a thing that says like, there's a rule that says, hey, once you're bought in, you can't just liquidate. This is not like a publicly traded stock, in our co-op. You actually, there's a rule that says you have to sell it to one of us who's already in it or something like that.
I mean, this is Coinbase. It's not even hippie stuff. Like this is what Coinbase does to protect its ass and protect assets. It does both. And I actually don't like that. I understand why they do it, though. There's a lot of reasons why they do it. They don't let you take out more than like $2,000 a day. I think if you get on Coinbase Pro, you can move a lot more money, and you have all of these other barriers.
You can't liquidate more than 2,000, or you can't put in more than 2,000, or either.
At certain tiers. You can't liquidate more than $2,000 a day.
They don't want to run on the Coinbase, right?
They don't want to run on the Coinbase. That's right. Especially if the regulators come along and say we're if you ban, they ban it or do something like make anybody who owns crypto have a banking license. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that the government can come along and try to destroy this. They'll never fully destroy it, but they can take a massive shit in both the price and the utility of it for a while. And I'm waiting for that day. Like I'm really waiting for that day to come. I'm scared to death of it because not only do, because I have a certain level of human greed. But I also think that I'm scared of it because some of the promise of these technologies are going to be muted could be a decade if the regulators come in.
Sure. Well, this is one of these great things where we can, talk about industries that like try to do something like regulatory capture to get the state to kind of partner with them to do the regulation. And then other industries that try to like avoid it. I think in my sort of world of transformation, psychotherapy versus coaching, like psychotherapy has sort of like glommed onto the state, and then coaching has tried to kind of self-regulate with its own institutions internal to its own marketplace.
Well, think about the SEC rules that you started off with. It's like you have to be an institutional investor. You have to prove that you have certain net worth, that you have enough money to lose if you lose your ass, that you're going to be okay, and that you don't. And if
Right.
you've got this much money, we assume you're not going to do anything stupid. But what that essentially does is says only rich people get to get richer.
Exactly. And it's one of the effects of it, for sure.
And
But
the institutional investors love that regulation because they cartelize.
Yes, you're looking at the corrupt. Now I'm going to fight you a little bit on this. You're looking at the corrupt side of it, but the good side of it is, or let me just
I'm
say,
just showing the process of regulatory capture.
that's true. That's right. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that aspect of it.
Yeah.
That's how regulatory capture works, and yes, it becomes a protection for the people who already have the power to have more power and that whole thing. And when Facebook says, "Hey, federal government, come regulate us," they're doing a similar sort of thing.
Yep.
But here's the thing. The positive reason for wanting some kind of regulatory function, let's just separate it from the state, is to actually protect people from getting exploited. If we sort of like remove more and more barriers to entry, or like friction, or the user interface is super easy, or whatever, you can put as much or little as you want to in it, blah blah blah, or we don't have some kind of like certain penalties to exit, like hey, you got to sell your shares back into the co-op population to exit, otherwise you're stuck with them. Whatever the rule is, you could like we said, with these smart contracts, you could build whatever fucking rule you want into them. Like you have to meet the conditions of the rule for the smart contract to execute. Okay, cool. Like, but some of those things could be a decentralized regulatory function that is there to protect. Right? Like I don't have to have a middleman with a state and with the guns and the brutes to come around. I could just have a thing that says like, you click here and you buy into our,
regulatory framework,
our mutual aid group, which is, 10,000 people strong out here, and whatever this is. It's sort of like a cryptocurrency based insurance mutual. Let's just say it's something like this. This is actually a template that I think is going to become more widely spread. Something like collectivized insurance that is not centrally administered by a corporation, but is administered by a nexus of smart contracts amongst all the participants. I think this is a great use case.
I will tell you, Michael Porcelli, that
yes.
I literally spent a year and a half of my life trying to build this.
That's right.
Through Social Evolution.
Uh-huh.
I wrote an article back in, I want to say 2018, 2017. Sometime along that in there, I think it was 2017, called How We Become the Social Safety Net.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I introduced the notion of a DISC, Distributed Income Support Cooperative.
Yep.
Okay. And one of the things that we tried to do, I brought together a team of people to work on what would be the rule set involved. What is the consensus mechanism for awarding someone some sort of payout for their problem?
That's right.
How do you prove, how do they prove that they actually have a problem? They're not trying to game the system, and so on. And it's a complicated thing. And it was way above my pay grade. It also turned out to be illegal on about 5 different regulatory dimensions here in the United States. And I didn't have the money, the capital to take it offshore. So, but it's interesting because in the United Kingdom, particularly like the Isle of Man and places like that, they're starting to experiment with some of this stuff. There's a group out of India that's building some of these mutuals through blockchain. They've got their own blockchains. It's really cool stuff. So you're absolutely right. This is already stuff starting to happen. This is one of the things I wanted to work on most, because I tend to I don't think of this in terms of only like, how can I make money holding some token and be the first to own it? I think about it in terms of how can we help people in ways we've never been able to help them before? How can people help each other to disintermediate the idea of this coercive welfare state?
Right.
And so I didn't mean to interrupt you, man. I'm glad you took us back there, because I love that stuff. And I'll put How We Become the Social Safety Net, Distributed Income Support Cooperatives in the show notes.
Right. I mean, what's so cool about these kinds of things is that we can essentially do something like, if you think about this, the welfare function of the state, it really is just like the state stepped in and took over what mutual societies were previously doing and said, we're going to do the social safety net, and like the best financial instrument to think about it is insurance, right? And if you kind of combine these things together, like a mutual plus insurance and a cryptocurrency, you get something that's like, oh, wow, this could really become the thing of the future. But the thing is, like those complexities that you said that were above your pay grade, there's got to be something that's going to prevent like marauding fucking pump and dump people just coming in and scooping up a bunch of it and liquidating it and like right, throwing up. Like there's actually has to be some amount of security, especially because if you think about what is one of the features that we're talking about, these different instruments have these different features, right? Well, one of the fucking features of insurance is it's there when you need it, right? Like that's, or at least that's in theory what it's supposed to be fucking doing, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if the barriers to entry or the friction to get in and out of one of these kind of collectivized insurance crypto thingies, mutuals, is too loosey-goosey, too anonymized, or too whatever, right? Like, you undermine the ability of that thing to actually be a security safety net for the people who want to build it. So you need to actually build. Now, this is a little bit like, soldiers in the form of like smart contract clauses or something like that to protect. Like that function that is the army that's conjoined with your central currency, is a metaphor now, but it has got to be in there somewhere, doesn't it? I mean, these things don't work if they are just like, it's almost like there's the libertarian version of cryptocurrency, which is like, no, it's got to be open access and it's got to be totally anonymous and anyone can enter and exit whatever they want.
Yeah.
And trustless, whatever that means. You're trusting the chain, but you're like, whatever. You don't have to trust any person, which is a certain set of features, which I think are really great for certain applications, just not this one, right?
Right. Yes. And this is one of the points that Arthur Brock makes, the guy who developed Scepter, which is the underlying code base and et cetera for Holochain. Holochain is a really interesting, different kind of technology from most things which are based on blockchains. But they have some of the, and they have some of the, you can almost instantiate anything in Holochain that you can in any other blockchain and more because of it, the way it's designed. I'll, again, show notes. Don't want to get into the technical details of that. Don't even think I can. Suffice it to say, at the macro level, this is a very promising technology that I don't think enough people fully appreciate yet. And the developer community is still relatively small. That being said, there are certain ways where you want what I term hypermediation, okay, instead of disintermediation. With hypermediation, you want more middlemen. You want everyone to be a middleman. You want checkers and checkers of checkers.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Decentralized regulation.
Decentralized regulation.
Self-regulation. Yeah.
Exactly. And there should be a decentralized consensus mechanism for the rules, the policies that are established in the manner of holacracy or something like that. But at the end of the day, there is that decentralized stewardship of the policies. Policies can also change in time to deal with certain exogenous factors or even endogenous factors. And so not everything needs to be trustless. A lot of things, anything that can be made trustless ought to be made trustless. But sometimes you want to create a system in which your community is radically involved, where everybody's putting eyes on the decision to be made, and that the consensus mechanism that arises from it gives everyone the incentive to take a look at the decision. And you can get cool. There's all kinds of ways to blur this together. For example, with decision markets. Okay. But there are also ways of doing arriving at consensus and incentivizing evaluation that makes sense at a very human level. We can't always think about taking out people, as you say. And that can, that's the libertarian wet dream. And I understand that. And for many dimensions of society, we want to preserve that, but not all of them. Sometimes we want to go ultra communitarian, where community is fashioned by individuals, free individuals, sure, but harnessing the wisdom of crowds.
Yeah, dude. So this is, I like that you brought in Holo. I mean, I know a few people on that project, and to the extent that I understand what they're doing, it is a little bit more of the extension of the ethos that we talked about with the mutual credits and the community exchange idea, right? It's like it's less about the anonymity. It's actually not about anonymity. It's about, we all know, like when I do a thing, when I like, babysit for you and you credit me for having babysat, so you and you go out with your baby mama or something like that, like that value, if we're ledgering that value in this particular system, this decentralized ledger system that is now our community exchange system, like I want that value to fucking stay in the community. And it's a little bit like Venmo. It's like so-and-so paid so-and-so for the whatever, right? Like in a way, I mean, maybe not every exchange has to be like, broadcast like a social media thing. But if we wanted to, we could go look at it and it sticks with the
so you want to
network.
shield it from the token arbitrageurs and the volatility and all that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because it'd be weird. And it almost doesn't make any sense. So you started going to governance, and I'm going to try to bring that in here too, which is like, if you have these kinds of features of your cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin does, right? Like a lot of anonymity, pseudonymity is really what it is, but and open access where anyone can just join, right? Anybody can mine, and you're sort of just presuming that there's going to be like cheaters, but you kind of create the consensus mechanism to expunge the cheaters. It's brilliant. This is Satoshi's brilliance. You can create a giant scalable network, open access network in this way. It's amazing. However, what you're stuck with is, if you want to fucking make a different thing, the only thing you're left with is forking, right? Like the
unless you're Tezos, which they figured out how to do it internally. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. That's where I'm going with this, right? Like as soon as you say, I want the value that's being ledgered or tracked on this network to remain in the participants of this network, then you kind of don't get to fork anymore. It's sort of like now my babysitting for you is worth like two versions of babysitting for me, one in this network and one in that. It just becomes, it sort of doesn't make any sense if you start right. You want it to stay in, but as soon as if you create a strong enough perimeter that sort of is like, it's not just the gravitational pull of the network effect, but it's one of these things that's sort of like, I call it a soft stick, whatever you want to call it, like penalties for leaving, or like making sure everyone stays, or you need a security feature, like one of your disk things, right? You don't want to just, it would be weird if people could fork one of your disks. It wouldn't make any sense, right? You're like, what are you doing? It's almost like another version of inflation. You're just like multiplying out, and now I have two insurance policies inside two different networks. It's just weird, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, so this is the thing about, imagine a whole set of properties. We can do a laundry list of them a mile long. Yeah. Right. So a system has properties, something, and each of those, and we'll make it really simple for it. So there's no shades. Each of these properties is either on or off, binary. Sure. Flick a switch, right? And we go down and we switch one way or the other, right? Has the property, doesn't have the property, on down for 100 different properties. If one of those is forkable and one of them isn't, let's see what happens. It could be that the network effects keep it from forking. It could be that we actually, we really do need this to fork. And so sometimes in the complex systems, the slight changes in initial conditions can make for unforeseeable macro effects. The butterfly in Brazil creates a tornado in Texas, right? So we know that. So establishing the initial conditions and thinking you're going to be able always to anticipate what the complex system is going to do is a fool's errand. But you got to try.
Right.
You still got to try. And that's why trying that experimental aspect of properties of money, properties of systems, properties of mutual aid networks, whatever you're talking about, we need the array. We need to be people to get used to evaluating the array of properties, the limitations, because there are always going to be constraints in any system, and there are always going to be benefits in any system.
That's right.
And so in thinking along these lines, yes, it's more complicated. Yes, it takes more time, but the overall effect will be Well, let me just ask you what you think the overall effect to be. I think we should spend the last little bit of time here talking about the real seismic implications for this in each of our minds. I want to know what yours are.
Oh man. Okay, so we're going in an interesting direction here. I think I need a little stepping stone before I get there, kind of to bridge something we were just talking about, which is like, yeah, these binary features. I think that was great. I do think once you start tying something on one of these systems to a real thing, it's kind of funny, like imagine real property, like real assets, like real estate, or this mug, right? Like not another mug. This mug belongs to the network or whatever it belongs to. At a certain, once you start tying the thing that's being ledgered directly to things that are not infinitely copyable, right? These are rivalrous goods, if you want to think of them in that way.
Yes.
Right. Then you got to,
not in the Schmachtenberger sense, but in the economic sense.
Yeah. But then what you need to do is to be able to fork. Forking doesn't make sense. Like in a way, these features kind of correlate. Like if the ledger is representing real assets and not just the value of a token, right? Or if you go really weird, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, are ways of actually making non-forkable tokens, right? Like, and that's the thing you want to point to as an asset. Then the network itself can't fork in any meaningful way, which means you need to put the governance of the protocol of that blockchain or that distributed ledger onto itself. There needs to be some decision-making or consensus mechanism or a code change mechanism that is governed by the participants within that network that basically say, yep, we're going to revise the code base, or we're not going to revise the code, or we're going to accept this change from that developer, but not this change from that developer, which starts to recreate something that looks like legislation or something like that, which is sort of weird, but like, I think it's unavoidable. Like as soon as you start tying the tokens to real assets that are rivalrous or non-fungible, right? Like then you have to put the governance of the protocol onto the chain somewhere. Otherwise you recreate a shadow power somewhere where like some collusion of majority plus one nodes in the network can go unilaterally change the code however they want to. Like you recreate a cartel, an off-chain, whatever you want to call it, cartel that can modify your chain, and you don't get transparent governance anymore.
Yeah, plutocracy is another problem. Oligarchy is another problem.
Yeah.
There's a tendency or a draw for the smartest people to try to figure out how to game any system.
There always will be.
Right? Always will be, right?
Yeah.
So the white hats who develop these systems are trying to figure out how to stop the black hats at all times.
Yes.
And critics of these systems are going to say, why in the world would you want to socially evolve towards something like that has so much uncertainty, so much room for vectors of attack by black hats and gray hats?
Yeah.
And the answer is, what the hell do you think that government power is? Right?
Right.
I mean, God forbid we enable the executive to have these levers of power. What if a Donald Trump got elected? Oh my God. Well, I'm ready to go for what I think the promise of this stuff is. Grounded in realism.
You're ready to go for it
because I see we're running out of time. But I don't want to hold you up on this last point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a grounded in realism issue that I have here that I think it behooves me to kind of say, because this is another piece of the stepping stone. I think we can go whole hog after this point. Like the critic would basically make that argument, right? Look, I don't really care if you can fucking cryptographically whatever and smart contract protect your thingy. It doesn't really matter. Though all that code is running on machines, computer machines, and those computer machines have physical locations, and those physical locations are somewhere on the surface of the earth, until we start putting them into satellites or whatever. And guess what? You can just send army dudes over there to take them, right? Like
at some level, and I think this is the way, when we talk about this kind of creeping way that, the SEC or whoever it is trying to like indirectly regulate these crypto marketplaces, you might say, oh, get away from my crypto, and be like, we can just self-regulate, the kind of like the cypherpunk manifesto people.
Mhm.
But I think that there's some validity to that, which sort of says like, if someone can go seize the machines with guns, then, there's always a credible threat that can happen. Right? I mean, what I'm saying is like this grounds out in physical world reality. Cyber reality is not just totally decoupled from physical world reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's electricity and land and physics and matter and energy flowing through all of these processors on these giant decentralized networks, and theoretically they can be seized, right?
Of course.
So
There's
don't you
always-
need to attach
there's
it to an
always-
army or something like that? A physical security force? Does that not need to be part of this equation somewhere?
No, I think. I mean, I think it's a good question, but I think it's the Hobbesian trap. Okay, and it's a trap of thinking that it's like we always have to have a final dispute resolution system. We always have to have some conception with the appropriate checks and the application of raw military or police power with bureaucracy staffed by angels, right? We are going to be able to have this state of affairs where there's an ultimate kind daddy
arbiter
that'll come kick everybody's ass if something goes wrong.
Okay.
And I think it's just as naive to think that we're going to have an angelic Hobbesian power as we're going to have architect systems that are completely secure and nobody ever gets violated or exploited. It's like,
right. Well, that's never going to happen.
We always have to ask as compared to
it
what
already isn't true, right? Yeah.
The difference between the two models is that in the one case, the very loose feedback loop, this loose nebulous feedback loop of democracy, quote unquote democracy, which isn't even pure. It's executed and instantiated by quote unquote representatives, all of whom have different incentives that are different from what they were elected for. This is a terrible feedback loop for change. But with systems that are constantly evolving in real time, democracies don't evolve in real time. They devolve in real time. And so at least knowing we're going to have problems with all of these nascent crypto token ecosystems and the systems that we participate in, we know that they're going to be constantly someone with an incentive to fix it, make it better, to try something new. And
a positive incentive.
Yes. Yeah. And that process are much tighter feedback loops. I would put my money on that any old day.
I'm with you. I do want to, before we go, I just got to like plant a stake here for a future conversation and simply to say like, whatever this thing that you and I are dreaming up here about like the evolution of social technology into the future, where cryptocurrency and smart contracts and distributed ledger tech form one huge pillar of it, I think is awesome. And I believe that it's possible. And I think we have to reckon with essentially the red meme stage, like we've said in our psychosocial development episode.
Yep.
The red meme doesn't get disappeared. It's just simply down the stack from where we are, so to speak, the socio-cultural evolutionary stack, and it needs to be dealt with. And so like any kind of like anarchist solution or crypto anarchist solution comes back to like something like how energy
is allocated. Like if a central state power can fucking shut the power off, you're fucked. So you need to be able to like get your own energy. This is like a physics level thing. And then another physics level thing, which is maybe more like human bodies or something, is you got to deal with security. Physical security has to be dealt with. And I'm not using this as an argument for a Leviathan or an argument for like one final arbiter, but I am saying the seizure or destruction of computer processors that are running these networks has to be dealt with somehow by the network somewhere. And we can maybe debate a little bit more on that at another episode. But to me, the physical level security of these networks cannot just sort of be like left out of the equation. When we talk about
I mean,
the future.
there's always, some sort of attack vector or security hole in every system. Someone will try to find it and exploit it, especially the most powerful or people with the most to lose in the old order. I have no doubt about that in my mind. In fact, I'm scared to death of the war that is coming between the centralists and the decentralists. That war is coming, particularly as the old order becomes more still powerful, but starting to show its cracks. It's moribund. I want to give you a great quote from James C. Scott. I love this guy. I mentioned him twice in this episode, but he says, and this is an answer, something of an answer to the question of there's always going to be meat space power out there trying to take advantage of people, right?
Yes.
Says one need not have an actual conspiracy to achieve the practical effects of a conspiracy. More regimes have been brought piecemeal to their knees by what was once called Irish democracy, the silent, dogged resistance, withdrawal, and truculence of millions of ordinary people, than by revolutionary vanguards or rioting mobs. And now think about that quote and think about circa 2012. All of a sudden, there's this app that everybody's talking about in the Bay Area. And then this app, it's all of this, by the way, is operating in a legal gray area, but there's this app that allows you to hitch a ride, and pay a driver to hitch a ride. And it monitors you with GPS. It gets some of your information. So there's a certain level of transparency and safety. And holy shit, they start using it and it just burns out of control. We know that today is Uber.
Yep.
Uber and Lyft are, because in a lot of states, I think hitchhiking was illegal. It's not clear, like this legal gray area allowed for the birth of something that is now pretty established law now. And Uber and Lyft touch a lot of the world with people who have cell phones. And now there are decentralized versions coming out on the horizon that don't even need an Uber corporate to function as the intermediary, right? It's just code. Mm-hmm. So this inversion of concentrated benefits, dispersed cost, which is the special interest state that Mansur Olson says, that this process kills whole nations in time. Because if there is a concentrated interest, someone has a strong incentive to lobby, but everyone else in society doesn't even know what mohair is, much less that there's a mohair subsidy and that they're paying for it, right? So it's low cost. It's a low cost proposition to gain all the requisite knowledge to even go out in the streets and raise your fists. People don't understand half the shit they're having to pay for that is slowly dragging the society and the economy down, right? But what's interesting about these internetworking technologies is that they rapidly create new constituencies around the benefits of these technologies. And Uber ain't going anywhere. Uber gets regulated in certain jurisdictions and this and that. But at the end of the day, Uber stuck around. Uber's with us. We have legalized hitchhiking and it is safe. So likewise, I believe this inversion of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs can be seen as concentrated enforcement on the part of state actors, which are hierarchies, which tend to break down due to information problems, and dispersed benefits on the constituencies that are networked, all of whom can engage in the dogged resistance, withdrawal, and truculence of millions of ordinary people. And that is sort of why I think that all of this stuff is amazingly promising. Once this gets out, people are going to start to understand that governance can be a thing that we opt into, like a civil association or a club, rather than something gets imposed upon us by virtue of territory, conquest, and accident of birth. We're going to come to see that we really can have social contracts, and that you'll have to sign them and abide by them. That this is not some hypothetical or imaginary thing, that it is a real social contract, and that we will contract based on our governance preferences, that is not only possible, but it is desirable, and we will enter an age in which we use, instead of sticks, we use carrots, or we use sweet talk to beckon people to come into our moral universe, our civic association, our system based on blockchain. And that will create a global order that is completely decentralized and yet relatively peaceful. At least I hope.
I love it, dude. I'm with you. I think I'm glad we're ending on this note, because I think this is where I want to leave our listeners. Like, I think it's good to wrestle with it and debate it and to try to wrap your mind around what it is or the implications of it, or, what works about our current system and doesn't, and where we want it to improve and how we want it to improve. But like overall, I think this direction is correct. And my favorite way of advocating for it is to point out the things that we already have that are sort of like this, right? Like you can, at any time you go to but what about the state? We need it to do this. Or what about the corporations? We need them to do that. And you're like, we can always point to these alternatives where, there was a time when it was like, wait, if you want a real encyclopedia, you got to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And now the Wikipedia is 100 times bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica ever was. And it's pretty much the standard encyclopedia people go to. Now, it has faults, it's imperfect, but it's kind of incredible. And that was and still is, a giant decentralized peer-based authorship of a thing that has now become a global resource. And that's not under the control directly in any way by any state with people with guns or any monetary system that's attached to it, but it exists in a kind of network relationship to all these other systems that we have, like the internet, or Wikipedia software that's used to create and edit it, or this nonprofit organization called the Wikimedia thing. Now, I'm not trying to argue for Wikimedia in particular. I'm just saying this is an exemplar of the kind of thing that, when I envision what the world looks like in the system that we're talking about, is instead of all of these social functions, these social technologies essentially being aggregated under one authority, and whatever the United States Congress for us here in the US, and it's saying we need to be the ones to administer this part and that part and this part and that part, and it's no, why? Right? We already have examples of, in the financial institution, you have Vanguard, which itself is a mutual. Its funds that it manage own itself. Or you have co-ops, what are credit unions, which are basically bank co-ops, instead of commercial banks, which are banks that own themselves and don't want to exploit their customers, with banks that are owned by their customers, and they don't want to exploit them, with extra fees. So we have these kind of antecedent ideas, or if anybody's been part of a community organization, or if anybody's been part of a corporation that uses holacracy, people kind of get, oh, wait a minute, we can do governance for ourselves, for how we're going to coordinate our efforts and what we're going to do. So I'm really just kind of trying to extend this intuition that there's plenty of workable examples,
in cryptocurrency and, whatever we want to call these complementary money systems and frequent flyer miles. We already have that, right? Okay, cool. Well, what if we lived in a world where essentially we just disaggregated these corporate and state monstrosities, right? And essentially put them into a protocol stack of networks where essentially, it's like you're being a subscriber. I'm going to opt into this set. And then you could even have like curated lists or something like this. Oh, I'm going to opt into this group of services. And it's like your social services are essentially like, opt in, opt out, and sort of geographically independent.
Porch, and I hope in reading, The Social Singularity as well as After Collapse. So one of the big punchlines is polyarchy. And that's the idea, polycentricity and polyarchy. And this is really the idea of opt-in governance or consent-based systems. If we migrate to these consent-based systems, it's not to say that locally there's not going to need to be consensus mechanisms among people who live together. You might want to make a choice between, say, an intersection and a roundabout. But, all of these like territorial goods, through experimentation, we can see how best to govern those. And you want to have small jurisdictions so you can vote with your feet, because voting with your feet really allows people to hold in. By leaving a jurisdiction, the power of exit is stronger than a vote. For example, you live in California, I live in Texas. My state is full of the exodus of Californians who are just sick to death of the Bay Area and all of the mismanagement of that state in general. No offense, brother. I love your California voice. Don't ever go away. But the idea, but maybe maybe you'll eventually come to Texas and see the benefits of superior governance. I'm not saying it's perfect governance. I'm just saying it's something you can escape to. The more escape hatches, the more the ability we have to reduce the cost of exit in any given system, the more likely we are to have better systems emerge, which can be replicated, or certain features of which or properties of which can be replicated and chosen. And we'll start to see a system where there's more of an alignment around your preference for civil association rather than having that be imposed in the associated culture of patriotism or whatever the fuck be inculcated. That old Westphalian nation state order is going away. It needs to die. And what can emerge is this intersystemic governance options that people can choose. And when they do, we'll have governance by sweet talk, by persuasion, and not by coercion and standing armies. At least that's my hope.
Preach it, man. I think this is a great place to leave off. I think we hopefully have really opened the minds of our listeners. If you guys already weren't on this train, hopefully you were introduced to some broader, deeper, more fundamental thinking about cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, distributed ledger tech, and their social implications, which are maybe a lot more profound than you were previously thinking, especially if you were just in these things to, make a quick buck here or there or something because of the hype. So with that, I want to say goodbye to you all, and thanks for dropping in and listening. And please rejoin us again for a future episode of the Social Evolution Podcast.